Okay, we shall proceed. Professor Merriam, would you put the microphone, speak, and would all the witnesses identify themselves again for the record, please? Yes.
My name is Mervin Dymally. I am from Addis Ababa. I am a retired professor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is with a profound sense of gratitude and appreciation that I recognize this privilege granted to me this afternoon. I will be very brief. I have some historical background material, very brief, that I will leave out, and will talk only on present concerns. Allow me to relate a story I heard just before coming to the United States. An elderly lady, the mother-in-law of someone I know, was expressing great concern for the health of President Bush and was praying. Her son-in-law was curious to know the reason. She told him that President Bush was engaged in the task of bringing reconciliation and peace to Ethiopia, and that she did not want anything to happen to him. I think the lady, in her simple and perhaps naive way, was expressing the confidence that all Ethiopians had on the London negotiations that were to start on 27 May 1991. The expectation of all Ethiopians was that the London negotiations under the chairmanship of the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Mr. Herman Cohen, would come up with a peace plan for a new, democratic, and unified Ethiopia. As it turned out, however, there were no negotiations in London. The process broke down during the preliminary meetings before all the parties met together even once. I was in London at that time, Mr. Chairman. The government delegation's press release called it backdoor deals, and the Oromo People's Liberation Front, OLF, declared that the negotiations had died before they even started. As a result, the Ethiopian people are now confronted with the following facts. A, with US consent, a separate administration is set up in Eritrea under EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. With US recommendation, a new administration is set up in Eritrea under EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Democratic and Revolutionary Front. See, the two fronts installed in Addis Ababa and Asmara have unified military and political stand on the question of Eritrea. D, the two fronts have presently uncontested military supremacy over most of Ethiopia. In spite of these facts, there is still some hope for steering the two fronts toward the democratic process which will serve the interests of each group as well as the strength of the whole. This seems the only avenue to durable peace in Ethiopia. People who talk of Amhara, whatever it means, Tigrayan rivalry, miss the real issue. There is no truth in the allegation that the opposition to EPRDF in Ethiopia and abroad is based on ethnic or language differences. It is rather their position on the Eritrean question that continues to generate opposition. It may be important to bear in mind that when the war was intensifying in Tigray, the people moved by the thousands to the south, to the areas of Amharic speakers. When the war was intensifying around Asmara, thousands came to Addis Ababa. Do these facts indicate any mistrust between the two language groups? In the long history of Ethiopia, there is no record of armed conflict between the two language groups. The historical problem in Ethiopia has been regional, not tribal or ethnic. Let's also remember that of the three military leaders that Ethiopia had after the so-called revolution, none of them was what would be called Amhara by the definition of the experts. Another misconception is that the opposition to EPRDF comes from the remnants of the Mengistu regime. Nothing can be further from the truth. The regime was rejected almost completely by the bureaucracy, the military, the peasantry, and even by the members of the party. A real cause for concern related to the London event is the diminishing role of the Voice of America's Amharic program. The contribution of this program in the last 3 years in raising levels of awareness of the Ethiopian people, in fostering the values of the freedom of press, in providing accurate information and a forum for all groups has been immense. I know that Mengistu's regime did its best to stifle that free voice from America. Now I am shocked to learn from Addis Ababa that the program is on the verge of losing its priority. I see two problems here. One is that if the Voice of America's Amharic program is stifled or even appears to be stifled for expediency, we in Ethiopia do not only lose a radio program, we lose the best thing that we can ever learn from the United States, the practice of freedom. The other problem is that it sends the wrong signal to the new powers in Addis Ababa and Asmara. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to say most Ethiopians strongly feel that the United States has the moral responsibility to steer the country toward democratic pluralism, which is the only way to bring about lasting peace and stability in the whole country. Ethiopians ask no more than that. We all hope that the United States, in accordance with its best traditions, will continue to promote freedom, democracy, unity, and peace for the region. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your brevity. Dr. Brea?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to share my view regarding the historical perspective on the development of the political crisis in Ethiopia. My name is Asafa Abraha. I am Ethiopian. My training is in development economic planning, and I have been engaged in development field as a researcher as well as practitioner for a long time. I was among those Ethiopians victimized by the defunct government, was a political prisoner for 6 years in Addis Ababa. My testimony is based on the experience from the field and not on desk observations from the comforts of Washington, D.C. I've been going to northern Ethiopia since 1985 and watched the struggling people in action. My recent travel to Ethiopia included visits to Tigray, Wollo, Gondar, and Gojam. I have talked to many people who told me that they were doing everything they could to rid of the tyrannical Derg system so as to bring peace, democracy, and progress to Ethiopia. Some of the major activities at the time included land redistribution and work on soil and water conservation. Historically speaking, Mr. Chairman, Ethiopia is among the oldest countries in the world, with an ancient civilization comparable to other great civilizations, as some of the members of the committee observed earlier. Its past engineering and architectural achievements are still evident in the form of the monolithic obelisks at Aksum and many magnificent rock-hewn churches in the highlands of Tigray and Wollo. However, its system of government had been autocratic, and that autocracy had been expanded through feudal expansion and annexation to other territories during the scramble for Africa towards the end of the 19th century. Now, what are the causes of the political crisis in Ethiopia today? It is this autocratic system. It is the annexation and discrimination and suppression of peoples in the country. It's also the Eritrean question. As a multinational and a multi-religious empire state, Ethiopia's problem also included the issue of domination by the central ruling establishment and the international dimension, both at global and regional levels. All are related and interact upon one another. The anti-democratic nature of the state generated economic and political policies that block development. Cultural, linguistic, and social oppressions as well were made central to the policy of domination by the ruling establishment. Consequently, Ethiopia's capacity to create a dual process of assimilation within a nation and destruction of multinational forms through development, as in Europe, for instance, was impaired. Various oppressed peoples have been waging different forms of struggle for a long time to overthrow the oppressive system. Those of Walaga, Bali, Gojam, Tigray, etc. can be considered in this connection. The Ethiopian empire state did not treat the Eritreans any differently. They had acquired a relatively free press, free trade union, and freedom assembly during the British administration. The federal arrangement as well had given them internal autonomy. However, it's instructive to note that the Ethiopian ruling elites did not want the federation to be implemented as resolved by the United Nations. They considered it a direct threat to their hegemony and as an example to the other components of the empire state, which would demand similar states sooner or later. So instead of building on the experience gained from the federation and expand it to other provinces, the central government systematically and deliberately undermined it and unilaterally abolished in 1962. The cause of the political crisis, Mr. Chairman, is rooted in the nature of the system of governance. There has not been any democratic system universally applicable to all of Ethiopia. Although feudalism has been weakened in the main and its institutions have been dismantled, the Derg system was non-participatory and even more authoritarian. For the last 17 years, the people have been struggling to dismantle the authoritarian system and replace it with a democratic one. The victories that the struggling people have scored so far are not limited to military gains. They also include the unfolding of fundamental social transformation. In the process of the long struggle, the people have managed to dismantle the bureaucratic structures of the oppressive system instituted by the central establishment. From Aksum to Waldia to Mens to Gondar to Bahar Dar to Nakam, the people have established their baitos, shongos, chafes, or councils. They have been exercising the basic principles of authentic democracy, that is, electing their delegates to represent them in the shongos and to hold them accountable and recall them at any time. There are already local democratic government structures in place. Further, the struggling people have achieved access to and control over their major means of production, that is, land. It's owned by the people and controlled by their own councils. So far, radical and equitable land redistribution has been carried out in Tigray, Wollo, Northern Shoa, and Gondar. Peasants are able now to enjoy the fruits of their labor and dispose of their produce wherever they want and at prices determined by market forces. They cannot be forced any longer, as indeed they had been hitherto by the Derg, into villagization, collectivization, resettlement, and conscription into the army. Peasants are no longer forced to make crop and labor contributions. The role of the democratic fronts in all those democratic successes has been to enable the people to set and pursue their own agenda. This has been achieved through what can be described as a bottom-up or grassroots approach, which consists of the strategies of facilitatory, persuasive, demonstration, and advisory. It needs to be noted that the process of struggle has been a process of learning. It has been a process of mutual learning for both the people and the fighters. The most important achievement of the learning process has been the realization of the fundamental fact that in order for the struggle to succeed, it has to serve the democratic rights and interests of the struggling people. The people here are at the center stage. Some individuals of the exiles in Washington find it difficult to accept the glorious victories of the people of Ethiopia over the tyrannical regime. It is ironic that rather than celebrate the fall of tyranny, some of the exiles are making frantic attempts to stir up conflicts among the various ethnic groups of Ethiopia. They have been making inflammatory rhetorics to foster ethnic division and animosity. It should be noted that some individuals of the exiles in Washington who are shedding crocodile tears were the very people who helped design the tyrannical system and carry out its atrocities against the Ethiopian people and the country. If their actions and rhetorics are anything to go by, they must have been beneficiaries of the defunct tyrannical system. They are so desperate about the victories of the people that they claim so much through some of their mouthpieces in the press, such as that the Tigrayans are occupation forces, they are invading forces, and that they are a minority, etc. It would be against the democratic aspirations of the people of Ethiopia if the previous ruling elites who came from a minority should be replaced by another minority. When speaking of numbers, however, it should be remembered that much as they paid huge sacrifices to protect the independence of Ethiopia in the past, the people of Tigray have paid disproportionately immense sacrifice during the struggle to defeat the totalitarian regime. Having said that, it should be added that the people of Tigray aspire for peaceful and democratic resolution of the conflicts to bring about equality and progress. They want, together with their other Ethiopian compatriots, to build a democratic Ethiopia where everyone feels they belong there, where discrimination against nationality and religion is abolished once for all, and an Ethiopia where there will not be any second-class citizens anymore. What those individuals exiles claim and think, whatever they think, the popular democratic struggle has defeated the tyrannical system because the people not only supported but fully participated in it. The struggle has succeeded because it is an authentically democratic and popular struggle led by revolutionary democratic forces. What does one understand by unity in the Ethiopian context? Is it territorial or people's unity that one is talking about? Whose interest does unity serve? These questions must be seriously tackled. The issue of unity cannot be viewed in isolation from the democratic question. They are interrelated. If unity is to serve the interests of the people, it has to be brought about by themselves. Unity cannot be sustained by means of force. Thus, there is no difference between unity and democracy. The people expected democracy from the 1974 revolution. When the Derg took over power, the situation got from bad to worse. The suppression was more intensified. The policy of oppression continued unabated. Yet, the Derg continued with a slogan of unity and committed horrifying atrocities against the people in various areas of the country. However, unity did not come about. Instead, the struggle against oppression and for democracy got strengthened and spread throughout the country. So if the question then is, if there is democracy, there is no reason why there will not be unity. Unity is mutual. People live in unity in order to serve their own interests and not to do favor to others. Unity can come about on the basis of mutual interest. If, on the other hand, oppression and coercion continues, there would not be unity and the country could be disintegrated. The state reached currently in Ethiopia can be characterized by the following factors. The tyrannical system which had been suppressing all the peoples has been demolished. This has opened the way for reconciliation and magnanimity, and the great majority of the population had suffered under the same system. The condition for ensuring the process of self-determination has been created through A, the establishment of law and order and relative stability, B, dismantling of the coercive structures of the defunct system. These achievements so far will help unfold the process of democratization and creation of lasting peace in Ethiopia. It must be underlined here that in spite of the doomsayer's prophecy that the marauding forces were going to cause bloodbath, take revenge and vendettas in Addis Ababa, nothing of the sort has happened. All indications are that, notwithstanding of the actions of some individual exiles in Washington, the people of Addis Ababa are satisfied with what the EPRDF interim government has done so far. The conflicts in Ethiopia have to be peacefully and democratically resolved. In other words, if the democratic solution is practiced in Ethiopia, it will also resolve the Eritrean problem. All the parties concerned should work towards the process of peaceful and democratic resolution of all the conflicts in Ethiopia. The interim government has been taking the following actions that lead towards peace and democracy: ensuring security and stability in the capital and the country as a whole, resuming emergency relief supplies to the affected areas, including deploying all military vehicles towards that objective, transferring ammunition depots from the capital city to other safer areas. All these positive actions towards peace are being watched by diplomats in Addis Ababa and the international community at large. All forces should help in the peaceful and democratic resolution of the conflicts in Ethiopia through the principle of self-determination. The US is on record in recognizing this principle, which is commendable. The US has also to help in the provision of emergency relief and recovery and reconstruction assistance. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much indeed. May I suggest to the other witnesses that if they wish, they may enter their entire statement into the record and could summarize it. Mr. Dresser, you may proceed.
Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be allowed to testify before you today. I especially want to thank Chairman Dymally for his invitation to appear. Ethiopians have a deep regard for the United States, not just because of its role in relieving famine, but because it stands as the finest example of the kind of society we wish to emulate. Like the people of Eastern Europe, who read aloud your Declaration of Independence during their freedom demonstrations last year, the words of that magnificent document strike a deep chord in the hearts of Ethiopians. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is why Ethiopians welcomed American efforts to end the 17-year-old long civil war between Mengistu and various guerrilla movements by sponsoring talks in London beginning last May 27. Unfortunately, however, the London talks did not include some of the most important participants in the years-long struggle to overthrow the Mengistu regime. Those who were invited included the representatives of the tottering communist Mengistu regime, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, or EPLF, whose goal is the separation of Eritrea from the rest of the country, the Oromo Liberation Front, and the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF, which supports the secessionist agenda of the EPLF. Other important organizations that were not invited include the Ethiopian People's Democratic Alliance, or EPDA, Ethiopian National Democratic Organization, also known as Democratic Ethiopia, Ethiopian Democratic Union, Kutat Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Democratic Front, and others. These groups not only seek to keep the country together under a true constitutional government patterned after those in the West, but wish to align themselves with the United States. These democratic organizations never received any support from their natural allies in the West, and thus had no armies. But Mr. Chairman, I would argue that they contributed just as much to the downfall of the regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam as the guerrillas did. It was they who worked incessantly within the bureaucracy, the party, and the army to undermine support for the regime. It was the Ethiopian People's Democratic Alliance who broadcast from a clandestine radio station in a neighboring country the message of a federated Ethiopia in which, like the United States, government is elected and each group has the opportunity to make its voice heard. It was this message that inspired entire brigades of Mengistu's troops to defect. Ethiopians were alarmed and disappointed, therefore, when the Democrats were not invited to negotiate in London. They were even more alarmed when Assistant Secretary of State Cohen invited the EPDRF to enter the capital city, Addis Ababa. Mr. Cohen's motives, I'm sure, were noble: to head off the collapse of public order and pave the way for a provisional government that could begin to put our ravaged country back together. But Ethiopians facing rule by the EPDRF saw this move as a betrayal by the United States. Why did America's blessing of the EPRDF cause such a negative reaction? It was because, rightly or wrongly, they see the EPDRF not as liberators but as conquerors. Are they right to fear the EPDRF so much? After all, it claims to be in favor of a democratic form of government in which each of Ethiopia's many nationalities will be represented, in which human rights will be guaranteed. But what alarms people is that the organization is closely associated with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. It is this close identification with Tigrayan-speaking Ethiopians, who, including Eritreans, make up about 12% of the population, that frightens other Ethiopians. They fear a new ruling class. They also fear that the EPDRF's support of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front's secessionist agenda will result in Eritrea splitting off from Ethiopia, perhaps taking Tigray along with it, tearing the country apart. If the new victors will institute a provisional government that includes representatives of all pro-democratic organizations, that calls a freely elected constituent assembly to hammer out a constitution guaranteeing all Ethiopians the kind of freedoms that Americans take for granted, then the United States should support them. But if they do not do these things, if instead they try to rule Ethiopia as Mengistu did, then Ethiopians of all nationalities will mobilize to do to the victors what the victors, in collaboration with others, did to Mengistu. It will be a tragedy as great or greater than all that has gone before. Ethiopians were perfectly content to see TPLF, EPLF, the EPDRF, OLF remove Mengistu from power. But they are not about to allow a new tyrant to take his place. Instead, they will fight. Like all my countrymen, I am overjoyed to see the last of Mengistu, and I am willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the new regime. But we cannot take their assurances for granted. A look at the program of the EPDRF shows why. It calls for a multi-party system, but says the rights of the remnants of the anti-democratic feudal class and the fascist Derg need to be curtailed up to and including denying these sectors the right to participate. Using that kind of language, it would be an easy matter to label whomever you wish as feudal or fascist remnants and take away their rights. The EPDRF program calls for major enterprises to be state-owned, operating under, quote-unquote, a national plan. It calls for government control of all trade and the confiscation of urban property by the state. It says that, and I quote, education shall have a revolutionary democratic content, meaning that children will be indoctrinated in the organization's ideology. It sets as a goal, quote, to overcome backward feudal culture and decadent imperialist culture, unquote. This can only mean that cultural traditions, including religion, will come under attack by the state. To anyone familiar with the history of radical revolutions, these statements are warning flags. They threaten the establishment of yet another regime that will try to control people's lives in the name of democracy and impoverish the country with their attempts to plumb production and confiscate wealth. 2 years ago, I published a white paper entitled Picking Up the Pieces, Democracy, Totalitarianism, and Ethiopia's Future, which I would like to introduce as part of my testimony. In it, I presented an alternative to dictatorship by the strongest. I proposed a federal system much like that of the United States. Under my proposal, the Constitution would give autonomy to local governments and guarantee basic rights by discouraging the centralization of power that in Africa invariably results in the rise of one-party rule and the rise of one-man rule. It would get the state off the backs of the people and give them the chance to prosper. Such an approach, I believe, is the only way to prevent further suffering and bloodshed in Ethiopia. But only America can guarantee this outcome. I am not saying that the United States must become embroiled in another years-long conflict. In fact, it will take a minimum effort. The new victors face a stalemate, a continuing struggle against determined resistance. Both sides unable to win, but unable to live with the other. They cannot turn to the Soviet Union, for it has itself become an international basket case. They can only turn to the West. That is why the role of the United States will be so important in the weeks and months to come. We need America to exercise its moral leadership, its tremendous prestige, to ensure that the new provisional government is truly a representative one, including all organizations that resisted Mengistu. If these goals are accomplished, the various ethnic groups will have no reason to fight. All that is needed is to remove the threat of dictatorship. If America uses its influence to guarantee political pluralism and basic human rights, Ethiopians can finally, after 17 years of profound suffering, awake from the nightmare and begin rebuilding their country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Walde? Mr. Walde, would you just pull the microphone closer to you, please? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I thank you, and I'm delighted to be invited to present my testimony on Ethiopia, a country I was forced to leave some 4 or 5 years ago in opposition to Mengistu Haile Mariam's Stalinist and repressive policies. Unfortunately, however, that country has once again come under the clutches of another ruthless and Stalinist tyrant. So it's almost melodramatic. Out goes Mengistu to Harare, and in comes Meles Zenawi through London, a twiddledee replacing a twiddledum. The outcome of the London conference was most disastrous for Ethiopia, most destabilizing for the Horn of Africa, and most disquieting for the rest of Africa. Trouble is, the conference, if it really was a conference, suffered from one fatal structural deficiency, which in turn led to some fatal outcomes. First, the confab brought together ethnically based armed groups who are the sworn enemies of the Ethiopian nation state and have formed an alliance to dismember and tear down that very state. Those groups with a multi-ethnic base who enjoy the broad support of the Ethiopian people, the vast majority of people who do not belong to any of these political groupings, either armed or political, were pointedly and deliberately excluded. Imagine, sir, imagine, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the PLO's Yasser Arafat sitting together with the Popular Front's George Habash to decide on the fate of the state of Israel without Israel's participation. Second, the conference also sent a signal and set the stage for Ethiopia's dismemberment through Eritrean secession. It was a blow, a dagger blow, aimed at the very heart of the integrity of the Ethiopian state system and a serious threat to the integrity of the African political order. It's no wonder that the decision outraged millions of Ethiopians all over. One cannot overstress the deep-seated, instinctive, and fierce resolve of all Ethiopians to preserve their national unity and independence. That unique independence had been defended by fierce resistance to no less than 8 foreign invasions, and that had forged a consciousness and pride of national unity and culture found nowhere on the continent of Africa. Those foreign invasions have by no means spared the territory known only in modern times as Eritrea. In fact, of the 8 invasions from the south, the west, and the south, and the north have involved Eritrea. This was scarcely surprising. For centuries, it was the political and the cultural center of Ethiopia, with the capital at Adulis, symbol of the independence which others, even before the colonial period, sought to suppress. Ethiopia, as the cultural, political, and economic sector of the Horn and its coastline of Eritrea, stood as a vast barrier to both European and Arab expansionist designs. That the people of Eritrea had, through a process of self-determination under the auspices of the United Nations, had exercised the right to determine and had determined that by deliberately and voluntarily linking their territory in federal association with Ethiopia was unfortunately, conveniently forgotten. Any future decision on Eritrea, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I would assure you, if and when it is taken, would have to be taken not by the inhabitants of one province, but by the people of Ethiopia as a whole. Thirdly, the decision to let in the TPLF, the African counterpart of the Asian Khmer Rouge, I would like to call them the Khmer Noir. Yes. The decision to let in the TPLF and occupy Addis Ababa and grab state power was tragic and inexplicable. How an ideologically intoxicated, ethnically narrowly based guerrilla force, as Francis Le Monde did say in this morning's editorial, headed by a radical Stalinist with no experience to raise and administer a family, let alone administer a country of 50 million people, should be asked to march in and assume state responsibility is beyond me to comprehend, and I ask for divine intervention. That must be the first time when a self-declared Stalinist is sanctioned by the United States to take over state power. The upshot of all these decisions and actions is to seriously compromise Ethiopia's fundamental interests. And the country is saddled now with a Stalinist regime which is just as repressive as Mengistu Haile Mariam's. But whatever has happened, Mr. Chairman, has happened in London. And it is time to correct mistakes and move on. There is no suggestion on my part at any rate that there was any deliberate plan on behalf of Mr. Cohen or the State Department or the administration in general to put Ethiopia in jeopardy. That has never been suggested. Ethiopia is always in love with Americans and respectful of the traditions and values and democratic institutions of America. So it remains to this very day. But mistakes have been made, and it is important, I think, to correct the mistakes and move on. And how can we move on? Well, I think the first thing is that the United States should reaffirm its traditional support for Ethiopia's unity and territorial integrity. The conflict in Eritrea should be resolved within the framework of a united Ethiopia on the basis of some form of federal association. Next, the United States should also work for the speedy democratization of the Ethiopian political system and the institution of multi-party democracy in the country. The US should have as its immediate objective the broadening of the current narrowly based rebel junta so that the vast majority of people excluded from the system under the London arrangements could be embraced and brought into the system. It should also work for the withdrawal of the EPLF and EPRDF occupying forces from Addis Ababa and other towns, and their replacement by a national army and a police representing all ethnic groups in the country. To that end, Mr. Chairman, I urge Assistant Secretary of State, Mr. Cohen, to invite and preside over a conference of all political groups, both within and outside the country. I particularly urge him to invite the coalition of Ethiopian democratic forces, which enjoys wide support in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian people love and respect and admire the American people. The United States is the only country with the political and moral stature to usher in democracy in Ethiopia and help defend it against dismemberment. I therefore ask members of the committee, I also ask the administration, in particular the State Department, to reconsider the decisions taken and the actions taken in London and bring about an orderly transfer of power from this tiny, tightly knit group of a military junta to a broadly based representative government in Addis Ababa with the unity and territorial integrity of the country intact. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Have you voted already? No. There's a vote on the floor now. The members will proceed, but I will continue to accommodate our last witness. Mr. Giorgi. You may proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify before this august body. After 30 years of fighting and war, the guns in Eritrea are silent, and peace reigns everywhere. That includes also Ethiopia. Eritreans everywhere are rejoicing now, repeating the slogans of the civil rights movement, free at last. Thanks God Almighty, we're free at last. And they're also repeating the slogans of the Jews who are remnants of the Holocaust by repeating their slogan again, never again, reflecting their dual heritage. The provisional government of Eritrea has embarked on the restoration of public services right away. Food distribution is given the highest priority and is going on smoothly. The seaports of Massawa and Assab, the international port in Asmara, as well as all major roads are open, and movement of people and commerce is moving unimpeded both within Eritrea and between Eritrea and Ethiopia. In Eritrea, the price of staple foods has gone down by as much as 60% within the first week of liberation. Within Eritrea, electricity and water supply systems have been restored to normal operation after a disruption of more than 2 years. Hospitals and clinics have resumed their function. Law and order prevails everywhere. Perhaps the greatest benefit from the recent developments is the alleviation of different forms of human suffering. The Coptic Orthodox Church in Asmara has taken responsibility, full responsibility, to take care of all war orphans in the country. Families that have been separated for up to 30 years are going to be reunited. There are close to 1 million refugees in exile all over the world. It's appropriate to mention at this juncture that there is quite a sizable number of Eritreans residing in the United States, and many of them have picked up American nationality. And they're very much interested in what goes on in Eritrea. The home country is as close to them as the United States is. They all have adjusted to life in the United States. They all are participating fully in the economic mainstream, both in business and the professions. And Eritreans, both at home and here, are profoundly grateful to the government and people of the United States for the help given them in their time of need. Eritrean work ethic and resourcefulness will undoubtedly create an economic miracle similar to that of Southeast Asian countries. The already existing industrial base, almost at par with that of Ethiopia in terms of capacity of production, will help Eritrea attain self-sufficiency in many essential commodities and become a regional economic powerhouse within a short period of time. A sound, market-based agricultural policy will enable the country to feed itself without any problems. My estimates, and I have been closely working with the relief organization in Eritrea, are that the present famine in Eritrea is the last one. This could be done with minimal assistance to the farmers in the form of seeds, implements, and improvement of the basic infrastructure. The new government in Ethiopia has proven itself to be responsible and trustworthy. Its respect for human rights is shown by the way it treats the former government and Communist Party officials. The whole process of change of government was done so meticulously that the bloodbath many doomsayers were predicting did not materialize. It's to the credit of the Ethiopian and Eritrean peoples that the war ended without the anarchy that accompanied the fall of dictatorships in Liberia and Somalia. The US government has played a historic role in bringing an end to the 30-year war in Eritrea and the 16-year war in Ethiopia. The decisive role played by Secretary Cohen in the London conference has made people who know the area and the nature of the conflict proud of the United States. His support for resolving the Eritrean issue through internationally supervised referendum and his courage to invite the EPRDF to take over Addis Ababa and to prevent bloodshed is highly commendable. In this regard, the US administration has shown its commitment to democracy. And Mr. Cohen, as the earlier speaker has suggested, has earned his place in history. And I would add to that that in due course of time, if this process reaches its logical conclusion, I have no doubt that Mr. Cohen will be a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Equally important is the good understanding that exists between the governments of Eritrea and Ethiopia. The opening of the seaports for Ethiopian goods without any delay and other ongoing relations are examples of the understanding between the two governments. Such an understanding is vital for carrying through the peace process and should be encouraged. The reaction of some elements of the Ethiopian exiled community outside Ethiopia does not reflect the reality in the country. What we are witnessing here is a deliberate scheme of deception and disinformation to create the perception of instability in the country. The ultimate objective of such a campaign is to grab political power by any means necessary and at any cost. One way of doing so would be to bring foreign troops into the country. A former foreign minister under Haile Selassie, after spending his entire life or career advocating non-interference in Ethiopian affairs, was shown on CNN recently openly advocating for the OAU to send troops to Ethiopia. We know the consequence of such moves. The other allegation that the EPRDF, the group that has taken power, is dominated by the Tigrans and that the Amharas, the dominant group up to now, have been left out falls in the same category. The composition of the EPRDF Council and the process they followed up to now shows that the front is representative of the Amhara, Tigrans, and other groups. During the last 2 years, the EPRDF was operating in the Amhara areas of the country. They lived with the people and shared their problems and views. They empowered the people fully by helping them set their own democratically elected local administration. By working close with the people, they managed to get their confidence and full involvement. The movement that overthrew the well-entrenched Mengistu regime was a movement of the people, and the Amhara people were very much part of this movement. They deserve credit. Knowing the tenacity and fiercely independent nature of the Amhara people, there is no other way any force could have passed through their territory except through their consent and participation. Documentary evidence from the area shows the sincerity and involvement of all the people. That's why there is no complaint or opposition from the Amhara people in Ethiopia. The only complaint we hear about is from here, 18th Street and Columbia Avenue. The people are part and parcel of the movement, and they are now the government. What's more, the people can speak and are speaking for themselves. The exiled community in this country definitely can speak for itself. So far, these people do not offer any new approach or insight. In the name of national unity, they are advocating for a continuation of the war policy followed by the two previous governments. They distort history by claiming that Eritrea was part of Ethiopia for millennia, that the Ethiopia they use for such purpose is the biblical name used for the entire Black Africa. True, history shows that modern Ethiopia was a buffer zone created by European colonialists during the scramble for Africa towards the end of the last century, the same time that Eritrea was also colonized by the Italians. An international conspiracy denied Eritrea its right for independence and let it be annexed by the expansionist government of Ethiopia. The bloody war that followed and the attendant famine and human misery is the result of the denial of the Eritrean people's rights. The few weeks of peace that we have now seen are proof that the region's core problem has centered around the Eritrean issue. It is in light of such glaring evidence that some Ethiopian elites aspiring for leadership roles and who believe that they are God's gift to the country are openly using every forum available, including the US government's media, the Voice of America, for advocating ethnic violence and destabilization of the society. They apparently are convinced that they can fish only in troubled waters. And if the waters happen to be calm, they are prepared to agitate them to suit their purpose. Thus, the choices available for the people and for their genuine supporters like the United States are very clear. Whether to proceed steadily with the recent developments toward a lasting peace or go back to the horrors of yesterday. The people have shown their desire and commitment for peace. The US should continue to play the historical and positive role it has embarked on. History will definitely remember this moment. In time, the people of Eritrea and Ethiopia will develop a solid relationship based on common interest and mutual respect. Such a relationship can be made to include all the countries in the region which may have to evolve with the establishment of customs union first, then a common market. Establishment of a democratic system of government and market economy can be conditions for joining such a union. Economic and other forms of aid can be used effectively as incentives for cooperation in the future. It's in light of all these positive possibilities that, Mr. Chairman, I urge your committee to support fully the move that's been taken by the State Department. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think today's witnesses prove the need for a national meeting of reconciliation because of divergent views. However, the committee is privileged to have such outstanding scholars and witnesses here today, men, unfortunately no women, with deep commitment and wide range of knowledge about their country. Mr. Giorgio, what is the ultimate objective of the EPLF in Eritrea?
The official position of the EPLF regarding the future of Eritrea is to let the Eritrean people, in a democratic process, such as a referendum, decide their future.
But what do they perceive as their future?
Tentatively, there are about 4 choices presented to the people. If they would like to be united with Ethiopia, that will be done. If they would like to have an independent state of Eritrea, that will be done too. If they want to have some kind of a federal arrangement, that's another possibility. And finally, any kind of regional autonomy could be worked out. But it's for the people of Eritrea to decide.
So in a referendum, they will have a number of alternatives to options to review before they make a decision on the ballot, so to speak. There'll be these 4 options before them.
Right.
Okay. Mr. Wooldy, you want to comment on the need for referendum or the request for referendum in Eritrea?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I believe there is no need for any referendum. The reason one wants to have a referendum is to know the wishes and aspirations of the Eritrean people. Now, the Eritrean people, through several processes from the end of the Second World War, had gone through the acts and different stages of self-determination. The 1947 4 Great Powers Conference decided to set up a commission of investigation, sent that committee or commission to Eritrea to investigate on what the people of Eritrea wanted to do. That commission came with a recommendation that the majority of people wanted to associate themselves with Ethiopia. But later on, the 4 Power Great Commission's responsibility shifted from there to the United Nations. And the United Nations set up a United Nations Commission for Eritrea, which had 5 members of it, 3 of whom were violently opposed to the Ethiopian nation state, particularly Pakistan. That commission went to Addis Ababa, attended rallies, went to churches, to synagogue, to mosques, visited schools and factories, and decided at the end of the day, the vast majority of the people of Ethiopia want either total association with Ethiopia or some form of federal association. The commission went back to the United Nations and drafted a federal constitution for Eritrea, which was approved by the people through the Eritrean Assembly. And therefore, the decision on whether to belong or be member of Ethiopia has already been taken by the people of Eritrea. One cannot give the right of self-determination every 15 years or 20 years or every generation. But if it is found necessary at some point in the future for the people of Eritrea to decide the future, well then, since there are so many developments since the Second World War, and the people of Ethiopia are affected in many ways through direct cultural, political, and economic interrelationship, that opportunity or that referendum should be made available, should be made open to the people of Ethiopia, and so that the people of Ethiopia should decide. And more importantly, it should also be suggested the decision on whether one should have a referendum in Eritrea or the whole of Ethiopia should be preceded by the democratization of the political life of the people of Eritrea and Ethiopia. Because if a referendum were to be held today, now in Eritrea, it will be held under the totalitarian control of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which is a totalitarian organization with all the nomenclatura of communist organizations elsewhere in Europe, in Eastern Europe. It had its cells in factories, in towns, in villages, and schools. And people will be forced, literally forced to vote for the referendum. There are some of us who cannot speak for unity of Ethiopia, even in this country. We are harassed. Is it possible for an Eritrean living in Eritrea under these conditions to vote of his own free will to join Ethiopia? And therefore, these are some of the considerations that have been taken into place, Your Excellency. Thank you very much.
We have approximately 5 minutes. Let me pose a general question to all the panelists. What do you see coming out of the July 1 meeting, and are you satisfied or dissatisfied that all of the forces, non-military forces, political forces in Ethiopia are included in this July 1 meeting? Yes, please,
If
Mr.
what
Dresser.
the Assistant Secretary of State Cohen said today takes place, then a lot of Ethiopians will celebrate. You see, the issue in Ethiopia is not who rules, whether the Tigray, the Amhara, or the Oromo. The issue is what kind of rule. As long as it's a democratic process, and as long as a constitution that guarantees all the basic rights you have in this country is in place, we have come to live with Americans, with Ethiopians. And yet, whether Afro-Americans or white Americans, their culture is so far from ours. If we can have brothers and sisters here and friends, speaking for myself, I have a lot of Afro-American friends and white American friends too. If I can live with people who have such a diametrically different culture from mine, I see no difficulty in living with my Tigray brother, my Eritrean brother, my Amhara brother, my Walaitu brother, and all the other ethnic groups, because essentially what separates us is very superficial. So the issue is democracy, human rights.
Professor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the July conference will be definitely an important one to decide the future of Ethiopia, and that is if one, the conference will have as participants all groups which may have various shades of opinions, political opinions, views, and whether they are armed or unarmed. At the moment, there seems to be the tendency to exclude some groups because of their history, background, and so forth. I think it is in the interest of peace that there should not be any exclusion on any ground whatsoever. I do not belong to any political organization, so I'm not supporting this or that. But I believe that if we want peace in Ethiopia, then there should not be exclusion based on any reason whatsoever. This is one. And there is a second snag, and that is, of course, an unfortunate one, that the EPLF will presumably attend the conference as an observer sort of thing, not really as a participant and cooperating and taking part in the final outcome, that is to say, in the transitional government. So, in effect, we will have, in spite of the transitional government that may be established after July 1, two separate systems. And I see some possible problems.
Dr. Brea?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a few remarks in relation to the question of unity before I come to the July conference.
You've got all of 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, my position as an Ethiopian is I stand for the unity of Ethiopia. But that unity has to be democratic, and the people have to decide. So at the center stage should be the people, all the people of Ethiopia to decide on the question of unity. It should not be the wish and desire of individuals or groups or political organizations. On the question of the July conference, I see it as a peace conference. And the forces, all the forces, be it they are within the country or without, the forces that stand for political and peaceful and democratic resolution of all the conflicts of Ethiopia should be represented in the conference. I feel that regardless of whatever crimes they committed against the Ethiopian people in the past, they should be allowed to face the Ethiopian people. And therefore, that peace conference should be all-embracing all political forces that advocate for peaceful democratic resolution of the conflicts in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Dr. Georgi, a very quick response.
I am itching to respond to Mr. Goshu Walde's statements.
Now let's pass that.
About the
We'll
totalitarian.
go after the second meeting.
Okay, about the totalitarian nature of the EPLF. I guess only him, as a former member of the Communist Party of Ethiopia, can see the inside mechanisms of apparatchik and how those systems work. But as far as I'm concerned, and from all evidence, the EPLF is not that kind of a government. So I'd like to raise this for the record. As far as the July conference is concerned, I also wish sincerely that all the parties concerned about the well-being of the country are represented, because Eritrea needs a peaceful and democratic Ethiopia as its neighbor.
Well, we want to thank all the witnesses for coming today. We've received some outstanding testimony. I want to announce that the committee intends to have staff observers at the July 1 conference. Thank you very much. Yeah, Mr. Payne has a closing observation. And all of the statements of the witnesses will be entered into the record.
Yes, I
Payne?
certainly would like to thank all of the participants who gave their points of view. I would hope, too, that the July 1 meeting, all parties could get around the table and discuss the future of Ethiopia, as it's been indicated by the first respondent, that if you can come here and live with people that have such different colors and hues and ethnicities from all around the world, it seems to me as an outsider, I'm not Ethiopian, although I know Tenestaning, and sometimes I'm mistaken for Ethiopian. Perhaps that's where I came from originally, my forebears. But the fact remains that to us outsiders, to continually hear the small issues that divide people who are almost all brothers and sisters, In the 1991, we're talking like we would be talking 500 years ago. And it would appear to me that the women suffer, the children die. When we sit and pontificate about whether the 62 referendum was fair or not, and I never read where the people voted in Eritrea in 62. I heard it went to the assembly and they cast the vote. I don't know how necessarily it could be unquestionably a fair vote since the people did not speak, but that's behind us. And I would hope that the attitude at that conference table will be a little milder than some of the hard attitudes that I've heard from some of the participants here today. Thank you very
The
much.
committee has just drafted you to go as an observer to Ethiopia on July 1. Meeting is adjourned.
That concludes Tuesday's hearing, and a note to join us this morning at 8:45 a.m. when the guest on our call-in program will be Paul Taylor of the Washington Post. He'll join us to talk about social policy, specifically pro-family tax policies meant to preserve the institution of the family. Again, we'll take your calls on the subject at 8:45 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:45 Pacific Time. In just a moment, remarks by Israeli Ambassador Zalman Shoval.
C-SPAN viewers who really want to know the people who debate and discuss the issues can now order the all-new